The void armadas of the Emperor. In the cold darkness between the stars, where reality itself becomes uncertain, and the thin barrier between the materium and immaterium grows gossamer fragile, the warships of the Imperium maintain their eternal vigil. These are not the gleaming vessels of some enlightened civilization, moving through the cosmos with grace and purpose. These are the brutal instruments of mankind's survival, kilometers-long cathedrals of adamantium and ceramite, their hulls scarred by centuries of warfare, their corridors echoing with the prayers of countless souls who have lived and died within their armored embrace. The Imperial Navy, known in the ancient tongue of High Gothic as the Navis Imperialis, stands as humanity's shield against the endless night. A vast armada numbering in the hundreds of vessels that patrol the million worlds of the Emperor's domain. While the Astra Militarum represents the hammer that strikes upon distant battlefields, it is the Navy that carries that hammer across the Gulf of Stars, that defends the vital arteries of trade and communication, that brings fire from the heavens upon those who would defy the Golden Throne. The scale of the Imperial Navy defies easy comprehension. Across the 5 great divisions of imperial space, the Segmentae Majoris, hundreds of warp-capable warships maintain patrol routes that span light years, respond to threats that emerge from the darkness with terrifying suddenness, and engage in fleet actions where the fate of entire sectors hangs in the balance. From the smallest destroyer, barely 3/4 of a kilometer in length, to the mightiest battleships that stretch 8 kilometers from armored prow to plasma-scorched stern, each vessel represents an investment of resources and manufacturing capability that would beggar entire planetary economies. The construction of a single cruiser requires the efforts of orbital shipyards the size of moons, can take decades to complete even when resources flow freely, and demands the expertise of tech priests who have spent lifetimes mastering the sacred rituals of starship construction. A battleship, those rare and precious titans of the void, may require a century or more to build, consuming materials measured in megatons, and crewing requirements that number in the tens of thousands. Beyond the pure warships of the Navy proper, the Imperial fleet encompasses merchant vessels that number in the millions, carrying the goods and materials that sustain the Imperium's vast industrial machine. Civil fleets of privately owned craft operating under licenses granted by fleet authorities, and the specialized vessels of other Imperial organizations. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains its own extensive fleets, dispatched to seek lost archaeotech and follow rumors of precious standard template construct technology. The Adeptus Astartes, those superhuman warriors descended from the Emperor's gene-forged sons, field their own chapter fleets independent of Navy control. The Inquisition operates vessels ranging from swift couriers to heavily armed cruisers, backed by the League of Black Ships that transport the precious and dangerous cargo of psychers from across the galaxy to Terra. Even the Adeptus Arbitus and Adeptus Sororitas maintain their own modest naval assets. Yet, despite this bewildering array of spacecraft, when the Imperium speaks of its void armadas, it is the warships of the Navy that spring to mind. Those vessels built for one purpose alone, to carry the Emperor's wrath across the stars and visit destruction upon his enemies. The warships themselves are things of terrible beauty, each a unique marriage of ancient design and individual character. while standardized classes exist, allowing any orbital facility throughout Imperial space to service vessels of known configuration. The reality is that two ships of the same class, constructed in different forge worlds, may bear little physical resemblance to one another. A lunar-class cruiser built in the shipyards of Cypra Mundi in the Segmentum Obscurus will differ substantially from one constructed in the orbital docks of Car Derniash in the Ultima Segmentum, and even more so from a lunar forged in the Ring of Iron that girdles Mars itself. Yet all will share roughly equivalent operating characteristics, weapons configurations, and tactical profiles. This apparent contradiction, standardization without uniformity, perfectly captures the nature of the Imperium itself, a realm bound by tradition and regulation, yet fractured into countless local variations by the simple vastness of the galaxy it spans. The ships bear the marks of their origins, Gothic arches and soaring spires rising from the hulls of vessels built in the Segmentum Obscurus, where the influence of ancient Terran architecture remains strong. Brutal functionality dominating the designs of forge worlds that prize efficiency over aesthetics. Baroque ornamentation covering every surface of warships constructed in regions where the imperial cult holds particular sway. The role of the Imperial Navy extends far beyond simple warfare. While fleet engagements against hostile xenos armadas or the traitor forces of chaos represent the most dramatic aspect of naval operations, the day-to-day reality involves routine patrols through vast reaches of empty space, escorting merchant convoys through regions threatened by pirates or raiders, transporting regiments of the Imperial Guard across the stars to distant war zones, providing orbital support for ground campaigns, and maintaining the visible presence of Imperial authority in systems that might otherwise drift toward independence or rebellion. A sector battlefleet, the typical operational formation of the Navy, must simultaneously defend dozens or even hundreds of star systems spread across thousands of light years, respond to threats that can emerge without warning from the depths of the warp, and do all of this while facing chronic shortages of vessels, crew, and supplies. The calculus is brutal in its simplicity. The Imperium contains over 1 million worlds, spread across a galaxy roughly 100,000 light-years in diameter. Even if every naval vessel in the Imperium were positioned to defend a single system, there would not be enough ships to provide more than token protection to each world. In practice, the Navy must make impossible choices, determining which systems merit permanent defense forces, which can be adequately protected by periodic patrol visits, and which must simply trust in the Emperor's protection and the deterrent value of potential retribution. This reality shapes everything about how the Navy operates. Unlike the massed armadas of the Great Crusade, when expeditionary fleets numbering hundreds of vessels pushed outward into the darkness to bring worlds into compliance with the Emperor's will, the modern Navy rarely, if ever, assembles its full strength in one location. Sector battle fleets are divided into multiple battle groups, each assigned specific responsibilities and patrol zones. These battle groups may operate independently for months or years at a time, out of contact with higher command, making decisions that affect the fates of millions based solely on the judgment of their commanding officers. Only in times of extreme crisis, when a sector faces invasion by a major xenos incursion or a Black Crusade erupts from the Eye of Terror, does the Navy attempt to concentrate its forces. Even then, the process of assembling a major fleet can take months or years, as ships are recalled from distant patrols, withdrawn from escort duties that leave merchant shipping vulnerable, and gathered from reserve squadrons that represent the Navy's final strategic reserve. The men and women who crew these vessels come from every stratum of imperial society, from the highest nobility to the lowest pressed labor. The officer corps of the Navy draws heavily from the noble houses of the Imperium, families that have provided commanders to the fleet for millennia, and whose scions are raised from birth to understand the responsibilities of command. These officers live in palatial quarters aboard their vessels, their staterooms rivaling the accommodations of planetary governors, complete with bedrooms, offices, wardrobes, private bathrooms, and in some cases entire harems of concubines and servants. This is not mere indulgence, though excess certainly exists. The Navy's command structure recognizes that officers may spend their entire careers aboard ship, decades or even centuries of service, during which a warship becomes their home, their world, and their entire universe. Providing them with comfortable quarters and allowing them to maintain something approaching a normal life is both a practical necessity and a calculated retention strategy. A Navy career is not a temporary posting, but a lifelong commitment, and the service must compete with planetary governorships, positions in the administratum, and countless other opportunities available to those born into privilege. Below the officer class, the lower ranks lead lives of increasing hardship. Junior officers and chief petty officers enjoy decent quarters with private sleeping areas and basic amenities. The armsmen and mid-ranking crew members have adequate accommodation, typically a bunk, chemical toilet, and storage locker. This is not mere indulgence, though excess certainly exists. But the lowest levels of the crew, the conscripted laborers and slave ratings, who form the vast bulk of a warship's personnel, exist in conditions that barely qualify as human. Sleeping pallets infested with vermin, toilets shared among dozens of crew members, and rations that provide just enough nutrition to maintain working efficiency characterize their existence. These are the souls who toil in the plasma furnace chambers where temperatures soar to levels that would instantly kill an unprotected human, who crawl through the ship's endless maintenance tunnels, performing repairs in cramped spaces barely large enough to fit a human body, who load the massive shells for the macro cannons by hand when automated systems fail. Their lives are measured not in years, but in survival, each day a victory against the myriad dangers of shipboard life. Fire, explosive decompression, toxic leaks, malfunctioning machinery, disease spreading through overcrowded quarters, accidents in the cargo bays where a moment's inattention can mean being crushed between shifting containers. These hazards claim a constant toll. Yet for all the harshness of their existence, these crew members are not chattel to be casually discarded. A warship requires tens of thousands of trained personnel to function, and while individual crew members may seem replaceable, collectively they represent an irreplaceable asset. A captain who burns through crews through negligence or cruelty will find their ship's efficiency declining, maintenance degrading, and response times increasing until the vessel becomes a liability rather than an asset. The Imperial Navy traces its origins to the Great Crusade, that epic-defining era when the Emperor of mankind emerged from the age of strife to reunite the scattered colonies of humanity beneath the banner of the Imperium. In those days, the Navy as a separate institution did not exist. Instead, the fleets that carried the Emperor's warriors across the stars formed part of a unified military force known as the Imperial Army, later renamed the Exercitus Imperialis. These fleets, collectively termed the Armada Imperialis, operated under an organizational structure quite different from the modern Navy. Each imperial cruiser would be assigned a single imperial army regiment, with the regimental commanding officer holding authority over both the ground forces and the vessel itself. This created tactically flexible combined arms units capable of responding to a wide variety of situations without requiring extensive coordination between separate chains of command. The arrangement had obvious benefits. When an expedition discovered a world requiring compliance, the same officer who commanded the ground assault had direct control over the orbital assets supporting that assault, eliminating potential conflicts between Army and Navy commanders over resource allocation and tactical priorities. The ships of the Great Crusade era differed in character from those of the modern Navy, though many design lineages trace their ancestry back to those legendary vessels. The demands of the Crusade required ships that could not only carry armies and deliver apocalyptic destruction, but also endure the hazardous transit through warp space, withstand the titanic forces encountered in deep void operations, and maintain operations for years at a time far from any support infrastructure. These requirements drove the development of ship designs that, while varying enormously in detail, shared certain fundamental characteristics. Robust construction that could absorb tremendous damage and continue fighting. Massive void shield arrays to ward off enemy fire. Arsenals capable of reducing entire continents to molten slag. And crew quarters for thousands or tens of thousands of personnel. The Great Crusade fleets also benefited from a level of technological sophistication that would gradually erode over the following millennia. Standard template construct technology, though already rare, remained available to the great forge worlds, allowing construction of systems and components that later ages could maintain but not reproduce. The ships themselves were maintained by tech priests who understood not merely the rituals required to appease machine spirits, but the underlying principles of how those systems functioned. Perhaps most significantly, the Great Crusade era saw the construction of several unique vessels that would become legends in their own right. The Phalanx, fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists Legion, a mobile star fortress of such immense size that entire battle fleets could dock within its bays. The Nicor, a vessel whose weapons could crack open planets. The Mirabilis, the flagship of War Master Horus himself, which would be renamed the Vengeful Spirit and carry the arch-traitor to the very gates of the Imperial Palace during the climactic siege of Terra. These ships were never replicated, their construction methods either lost or requiring resources beyond what even the mightiest forge worlds could muster. They stand as reminders of what humanity once achieved, and perhaps what it might achieve again, should the Imperium ever recover the heights from which it has fallen. The Horus heresy shattered this unified military structure as it shattered so much else. When War Master Horus, most beloved of the Emperor's sons, revealed his treachery and plunged the Imperium into civil war, fully half the Imperial army turned traitor, alongside their Primarch masters. The scope of the disaster extended beyond the immediate military catastrophe. The revelation that military commanders could betray their oaths, could use the ships and soldiers under their command to forge personal empires or pursue agendas at odds with the Emperor's will, fundamentally undermined trust in the unified command structure. During the dark years of the heresy, scattered Imperial army regiments and their assigned vessels did precisely that, carving out petty tyrannies in the chaos that engulfed the galaxy, using the power of their starships to establish dominion over worlds that had neither the capability nor will to resist. These abuses, Though relatively minor compared to the overall scale of the heresy, convinced imperial authorities that the concentration of military power in single individuals represented an unacceptable risk. The solution came from Robo Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines Legion and Lord Commander of the Imperium in the aftermath of the Emperor's internment upon the Golden Throne. Among his many reforms, documented in his extensive writings on imperial governance and military organization, Guilliman mandated the separation of the imperial army into two distinct institutions: the Imperial Guard, responsible for ground forces, and the Imperial Navy, responsible for void assets. This was no mere administrative restructuring, but a calculated strategy to make future rebellions more difficult. Under the new system, Guard regiments would depend on Navy vessels for transport between star systems, but would have no ships of their own. Navy vessels would possess the firepower to devastate worlds from orbit, but would lack the ground forces necessary to actually conquer and hold territory. Neither service alone could pose an existential threat to the Imperium. A rogue Guard regiment might seize a world, but would be trapped there, unable to spread their rebellion without Navy support. A rebellious Navy fleet might bombard worlds into submission, but could not establish lasting control without ground forces to occupy the conquered territory. Only by coordinating between both services could a true threat emerge, and such coordination would require a conspiracy far more extensive and therefore easier to detect and counter. The Emperor himself, in one of his final acts before his internment, issued a decree that starships could no longer be commanded by officers of the newborn Imperial Guard. Command of Navy vessels would be restricted to officers of the Navy alone, creating a clear delineation of authority and responsibility. This decree, issued from the Golden Throne, carried the full weight of the Emperor's divine will and could not be countermanded by any authority within the Imperium. From this moment forward, the Imperial Navy would exist as an independent institution, with its own command structure, traditions, regulations, and culture. The separation, though practical in its intents, also created enduring tensions between the services. Guard commanders have chafed for 10,000 years at their dependence on Navy transports and orbital supports, while Navy officers have resented the Guard's attitude that ships exist merely to carry soldiers to battle. These inter-service rivalries, carefully cultivated by those who designed the system, serve as yet another layer of protection against unified military rebellion. The modern Imperial Navy organizes itself around the 5 segmenta majoris, the vast administrative divisions into which the Imperium divides the galaxy. Each segmentum takes its name and identity from its relationship to Terra, the throne world at the heart of the Imperium. The segmentum solar encompasses the ancient, densely settled heart of human space, centered on Terra itself and protected on all sides by the other segmentae. The segmentum obscurus extends to the galactic north, encompassing the Gothic sector and other regions that have the misfortune to lie in proximity to the Eye of Terror, that wound in reality from which the forces of chaos regularly emerge to prey upon the Imperium. The segmentum pacificus stretches to the galactic west, a region known for endemic rebellion and unrest. The segmentum tempestus lies to the galactic south. The segmentum ultima, largest of the 5, sprawls across the galactic east, encompassing nearly a third of the galaxy and including the realm of Ultramar and the approaches to the galactic core. Each segmentum maintains its own battle fleet,
commanded by a Lord High Admiral who oversees all Imperial Navy forces within that segmentum's downs. These 5 Lord High Admirals, though nominally equal in rank, acknowledge that command of the segmentum solar carries particular prestige as both the oldest and most strategically vital posting. The Lord High Admiral of the segmentum solar typically serves simultaneously as Lord High Admiral of the Imperial Navy, the senior-most position in the entire service, and in this capacity represents the Navy's interests on the Senatorum Imperialis, the Council of High Lords that governs the Imperium in the Emperor's name. This dual role, commanding the defense of humanity's birthworld while also managing the political interests of an organization spread across 100,000 light-years, demands abilities that few possess.
The position attracts individuals of exceptional competence, ruthless ambition, or both, and the machinations within Navy High Command rival anything found in the most Byzantine corners of the administratum. Below the segmentum level, the Navy organizes itself into sector battle fleets, each assigned to defend one of the thousands of sectors that comprise imperial space. A sector, roughly speaking, encompasses a cube of space some 8 million cubic light-years in volume, though the actual boundaries follow navigational routes and political realities rather than geometric precision. Within each sector lie multiple subsectors, collections of star systems typically no more than 20 light-years in radius, the practical limit of how far a Navy patrol can effectively respond to threats. The reality, though, is that vast reaches of space within each sector fall outside any subsector designation. These regions, formerly termed intersectors, but more commonly called wilderness zones, forbidden zones, or simply empty space, may contain unexplored star systems, uninhabited worlds, alien-controlled territories, dangerous nebulae, or regions rendered inaccessible by warp storms and other spatial anomalies. The Navy maintains a presence in these regions to the extent possible, but the sheer volume of space involved means that patrol coverage remains sparse at best. Each sector battle fleet consists of between 50 and 75 capital ships, meaning cruisers and battleships, supported by multiple squadrons of escort vessels numbering in the hundreds. These numbers, which might seem substantial, reveal their inadequacy when considered against the territory they must defend. A sector containing 200 inhabited systems cannot possibly station a capital ship at each world and still maintain reserve forces for offensive operations or response to emerging threats. The Navy solution relies on a combination of deterrence, rapid response, and calculated risk. The visible presence of Navy vessels on patrol, the knowledge that an attack on an imperial world will bring eventual retaliation, and the hope that any invasion force will be intercepted before achieving its objectives combine to provide a degree of security that, while far from absolute, has proven sufficient for 10,000 years. Worlds lost to xenos raiders or chaos incursions are tragic, but the Imperium's vast size means that individual losses, however catastrophic to those directly affected, barely register against the larger picture of galactic strategy. The command of a sector battle fleet falls to a Lord Admiral, an officer who answers not only to their superiors in the fleet, but also to the broader Adeptus Terra. The Lord Admiral faces the perpetual challenge of satisfying both military and civilian needs, deploying warships to patrols, permanent stations, and reserve fleets in a manner that maintains defensive readiness while also ensuring that critical convoy routes remain protected, that important worlds receive the visible presence of Navy vessels to reassure local authorities, and that sufficient forces remain in reserve to respond to crises. Most Lord Admirals choose to base themselves not at the Segmentum Fortress alongside other senior officials, but at the foremost naval facility within their sector, understanding that effective command requires proximity to the forces they direct and the threats those forces face. They are supported by Solar Admirals, prospective sector commanders awaiting assignment to their own commands, and by regular admirals who command portions of the sector battlefleet, typically a handful of star systems and the patrol routes connecting them. Below the flag officer ranks, the Navy's hierarchy becomes progressively more detailed. Vice admirals traditionally command the vanguard elements of a fleet, leading forces of light cruisers and destroyers charged with scouting for enemies, charting navigational hazards, and screening the advance of heavier vessels. Rear admirals command the rear guard, protecting supply lines and covering retreats when necessary. Commodores serve as adjutants to admirals or command battle squadrons, semi-independent formations built around a small number of capital ships. Captains, by the very nature of their title, command individual vessels, and aboard their ships, their word is law, superseded only by direct orders from higher authority or by the emperor himself. The Navy uses the term captain to denote not a specific rank, but rather the authority to command a ship. A full captain in the Navy hierarchy will command a cruiser or battleship, while officers of lower rank may nevertheless be styled captain when commanding smaller vessels such as escorts. A commander, for instance, might serve as first officer aboard a cruiser, but simultaneously hold the rank of captain when given command of a frigate or destroyer. The Imperial Navy's warships fall into three broad categories based on size and capability: battleships, cruisers, and escorts. This simple classification conceals tremendous variety within each category, but it provides a useful framework for understanding fleet composition and tactical doctrine. Battleships represent the pinnacle of human naval engineering, massive vessels ranging from 6 to 8 kilometers in length, though some ancient designs exceed even these dimensions. These titans of the void mount weapons capable of glassing continents, void shields powerful enough to withstand sustained bombardment from lesser vessels, and armor measured in meters of solid adamantium and ceramite. The construction of a battleship demands resources that only the greatest forge worlds can muster. The shipyards above Mars, which form the Ring of Iron, can construct perhaps a handful of battleships simultaneously, but even with the full resources of the mechanicists at their disposal, completing a single battleship from keel laying to commissioning will consume decades or even a full century. Crews number in the tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, when one accounts for the vast support personnel required to maintain such complex vessels. The Emperor-class battleship, perhaps the most iconic design in the Imperial Navy, exemplifies the characteristics that define these titanic vessels. Measuring approximately 8 kilometers from prow to stern, the Emperor class carries multiple launch bays capable of deploying squadrons of attack craft, fighter wings that can overwhelm enemy escorts or intersect incoming torpedo salvos. The ship's broadside weapons batteries, rows of macro cannons and laser batteries stretching along the flanks of the vessel, can deliver withering fire against enemies at close range. Dorsal and prow turrets provide additional firepower, allowing the Emperor to engage enemies approaching from multiple vectors simultaneously. Yet for all this impressive armament, the Emperor's greatest weakness is the same limitation that affects all battleships: poor maneuverability. These massive vessels turn ponderously, requiring minutes or even tens of minutes to execute course changes that an escort could accomplish in seconds. In fleet actions, battleships must be screened by faster vessels to prevent enemy forces from exploiting this weakness,
positioning themselves on vectors that the battleship cannot quickly turn to engage. Other battleship classes emphasize different capabilities. The Victory class sacrifices some weapons batteries in favor of heavy lance armaments, making it particularly effective at long-range engagements where its lances can pierce enemy shields and armor before hostile vessels can close to effective battery range. The Retribution class packs even more devastating broadside firepower than the Emperor, along with extensive torpedo armament that can saturate enemy formations with salvos of these massive anti-ship weapons. The Apocalypse and Oberon classes, ancient designs dating back to the Great Crusade, feature configurations no longer commonly reproduced. Their construction requiring techniques or resources that have been lost to the modern Imperium. These older battleships, when encountered in the fleet, are treasured relics, carefully maintained across millennia, and bearing battle honors that stretch back to conflicts now remembered only in the most ancient archives. Cruisers form the backbone of the Imperial Navy. Vessels that balance firepower, protection, speed, and endurance in a package that can be produced in numbers large enough to meet the Navy's endless demands. While not as powerful as battleships, cruisers remain formidable warships, typically ranging from 5 to 6 kilometers in length and mounting armaments capable of destroying lesser vessels or crippling larger ones. The crew complement varies from perhaps 1,000 personnel on the smallest light cruisers to 100,000 on the largest heavy cruisers, depending on the specific class and configuration. Unlike battleships, which can only be constructed at major forge worlds, cruisers can be built at smaller manufacturing centers, any civilized world with orbital shipyards of sufficient size. This wider production base means that cruiser construction, while still a massive undertaking requiring a decade or more even under ideal conditions, remains achievable for the Imperium in meaningful numbers. The Lunar-class cruiser, probably the most common design in the Imperial Navy, demonstrates the versatility that makes cruisers so valuable. The lunar configuration includes broadside weapons batteries for close-range engagement, dorsal lance turrets for longer-range precision strikes, and launch bays for a modest complement of attack craft. This balanced loadout allows the lunar to fulfill multiple roles: line combatant and fleet actions, independent patrol vessel hunting pirates or raiders, convoy escort protecting merchant shipping, orbital bombardment platform supporting ground campaigns, or exploration vessel pushing into uncharted regions. The lunar's ubiquity means that any naval facility throughout the Imperium will have spare parts, knowledgeable tech priests, and experienced crew available, easing the logistical burden of maintaining these vessels across vast distances. Yet the very flexibility that makes the lunar valuable also means it excels at no particular role, and more specialized cruiser designs exist to fulfill specific tactical needs. Light cruisers occupy a middle ground between full cruisers and escorts, combining aspects of both categories. Ships like the Dauntless class, among the most common light cruisers, measure perhaps 4 kilometers in length, significantly smaller than a full cruiser but larger and more capable than any escort vessel. The Dauntless typically mounts prow lances, giving it serious anti-ship capability, along with broadside batteries sufficient to threaten escorts and damage larger vessels. Its greatest advantage, though, lies in its speed and maneuverability. A Dauntless can outrun most cruisers and battleships while possessing enough firepower to threaten enemy escorts that might attempt to pursue it. This combination makes light cruisers ideal for reconnaissance operations, racing ahead of the main fleet to locate enemy forces and relay intelligence. For commerce raiding,
hunting down enemy supply convoys, or for independent patrol duty in regions where a full cruiser would be too valuable to risk, but escorts would lack sufficient firepower to deal with threats. Escort vessels, the smallest warp-capable combatants in the Imperial Navy, include both frigates and destroyers, with frigates being somewhat larger and more heavily armed, while destroyers emphasize speed above all else. These vessels typically range from 750 meters to perhaps 2 kilometers in length, tiny by the standards of capital ships, but still formidable in their own right. Escorts almost never operate independently, instead forming squadrons of 2 to 6 vessels that work in coordination, their combined firepower allowing them to threaten much larger opponents. The primary role of escorts in fleet actions involves screening capital ships against enemy torpedoes and attack craft, racing ahead to intercept these threats before they can reach the vulnerable larger vessels. Escorts also finish off crippled enemy ships, allowing the capital ships to concentrate on the most dangerous targets and pursue fleeing enemies, using their superior speed to run down vessels attempting to disengage from battle. Many escort classes specialize in particular roles. The Cobra-class destroyer, for instance, is built around torpedo tubes, sacrificing other armaments to mount these powerful weapons in a hull small enough to be produced in large numbers. Cobras operate in wolf packs, coordinating their attacks to launch devastating torpedo salvos that can cripple or destroy ships many times their own size. The Firestorm-class frigate mounts a powerful prow-mounted lance, an unusual configuration for such a small vessel, but one that gives the Firestorm the ability to threaten larger ships at range. The Sword-class frigate eschews specialized weapons in favor of a balanced armament of batteries and lances, making it a capable general-purpose escort. The Falchion class emphasizes lance armaments, while the Havoc class carries torpedoes alongside batteries. This variety allows Navy commanders to assemble escort squadrons tailored to specific tactical situations, with different squadron compositions excelling at different roles. The weapons mounted aboard Imperial warships fall into several broad categories, each with distinct characteristics and tactical applications. Weapons batteries, sometimes called macro weapons, consist of massive cannons and laser batteries that fire along the broadsides of Imperial vessels. These weapons excel at short to medium range, where their volume of fire can overwhelm enemy shields and armor through sheer weight of metal and energy. A capital ship's weapons batteries include hundreds or even thousands of individual weapons, from small point defense turrets meant to intercept attack craft and torpedoes, through medium batteries capable of threatening escort vessels, up to massive macro cannons that fire shells the size of small buildings. The coordination of this artillery in battle, ensuring that each weapon battery fires at the optimal moment to maximize damage while not interfering with other systems, requires constant attention from gunnery officers and their supporting crews. The broadside batteries create the fundamental tactical paradigm of Imperial naval warfare. Ships maneuver to bring their broadsides to bear on the enemy while attempting to present their own heavily armored prows toward incoming fire. Lance weapons represent a different philosophy of void warfare. Where batteries rely on volume of fire, lances use directed energy to punch through shields and armor with surgical precision. A lance battery consists of multiple directed energy projectors, essentially massive laser or plasma weapons scaled up to starship size, all focused through sophisticated targeting systems. The beams generated by lance weapons travel at or near the speed of light, making them effectively impossible to evade once fired.
This gives lances a significant advantage in long-range engagements, where the time lag between firing and impact can allow enemy vessels to maneuver away from slower projectiles. The trade-off is that lances typically deliver less overall damage than an equivalent tonnage of weapons batteries, making them most effective against vessels with weakened or breached shields. Lance weapons also require tremendous amounts of power, drawing directly from the ship's plasma reactors, and sustained lance fire can strain a vessel's power generation capabilities. Navy doctrine generally emphasizes lance fire at long range to weaken enemy shields, followed by close-range battery fire to complete the destruction of disabled vessels. Torpedoes provide the Imperial Navy with long-range striking power, weapons that can be launched from beyond visual range to track and destroy enemy vessels. These are not the relatively small anti-ship missiles common to planetary navies, but massive projectiles up to 200 feet in length, each powered by its own plasma reactor that also forms part of the warhead. The plasma reactor provides propulsion, allowing torpedoes to accelerate to tremendous velocities and pursue maneuvering targets, while simultaneously containing a fuel source that, when the warhead detonates, releases energy comparable to a small fusion weapon. The sheer size of the explosion generated by torpedo impacts means that even near misses can inflict significant damage, and a direct hit can cripple or destroy vessels many times larger than the torpedo itself. The primary weakness of torpedoes is their relatively limited guidance capability and slow acceleration compared to energy weapons. This makes them vulnerable to interception by point defense systems or attack craft, and allows alert enemies to maneuver away from incoming torpedo salvos. To compensate for these limitations, Navy doctrine emphasizes launching torpedoes in large salvos, overwhelming enemy defenses through sheer numbers, and forcing targets to maneuver in ways that leave them vulnerable to other attacks. The Nova Cannon represents the pinnacle of Imperial naval weaponry. Weapons so powerful they can only be mounted on capital ships, and then only at tremendous cost in terms of space, power, and maintenance requirements. These massive weapons use gravitic impellers to accelerate projectiles to substantial fractions of light speed before launching them at targets tens of thousands of kilometers away. The shells themselves vary in design, from sophisticated plasma warheads that burn with the intensity of small stars, to gravitational disruption munitions that can tear apart enemy vessels through tidal forces, to weapons that deliberately tear open small rifts in reality, unleashing warp energies against targets in real space. The destructive potential of Nova cannon fire is immense, a single well-placed shot capable of annihilating an enemy cruiser or crippling even the mightiest battleship. Yet, this fearsome power comes with significant limitations. Nova cannons are notoriously inaccurate, their projectiles traveling such vast distances that even minor targeting errors result in complete misses. The weapons also require the firing vessel to maintain a stable trajectory during the firing sequence, making them vulnerable to enemy counterfire. Finally, the sheer scale of the weapons means that only a handful can be mounted on even the largest battleships, and the rate of fire remains painfully slow. Despite these limitations, the psychological impact of Nova cannon fire cannot be overstated.
The sight of a capital ship suddenly detonating in a blinding flash, torn apart by forces beyond comprehension, affects even veteran crews, and enemies who know they face Nova cannon-armed vessels must balance aggression against the constant risk of catastrophic destruction. Attack craft form the final major component of Imperial naval arsenals, small one- or two-person craft that launch from carrier bays aboard capital ships to engage enemy vessels at close range. These fall into several categories, each fulfilling specific tactical roles. Fury interceptors serve primarily to establish space superiority, engaging enemy attack craft in dogfights among the stars and providing defensive screens around friendly capital ships. Starhawk bombers carry anti-ship torpedoes scaled down to match their smaller size, but still capable of inflicting serious damage on enemy vessels, particularly when attacking in coordinated waves. Shark assault boats fulfill boarding missions, carrying squads of armsmen or space marines who can breach enemy hulls and fight their way through hostile ships. The effectiveness of attack craft in void warfare fluctuates based on numerous factors. Against enemies lacking their own fighter screens or adequate point defense systems, attack craft can prove devastating, swarming larger vessels like predators pulling down wounded prey. Against well-defended fleets, the same craft may suffer catastrophic losses, achieving minimal damage. This variability makes attack craft a flexible but unpredictable asset, and Navy doctrine emphasizes maintaining the right balance between carrier capability and direct firepower. The protection of Imperial warships relies primarily on void shields, force fields that project a bubble of energy around the vessel, absorbing incoming fire by shunting the energy into the warp. Multiple shield layers provide redundancy, so that when one shield collapses under sustained bombardment, secondary shields continue protecting the ship while the first shield regenerates. The strength and number of void shield layers varies enormously based on ship class, from the single or double shields common on escort vessels to the multiple overlapping shield arrays protecting battleships, which can number 6, 8, or even more shield layers on the most heavily protected vessels. Void shields are far from perfect protection, though. Sustained fire will eventually overwhelm even the strongest shields, forcing them to collapse and leaving the ship vulnerable until they can be restored. Certain weapons, particularly lance batteries, are specifically designed to punch through shields more effectively than other weapons. Most critically, void shields operate unidirectionally, preventing weapons fire from entering the protected space, but also preventing fire from exiting. This forces Imperial vessels to momentarily drop shield sections to fire their own weapons, creating brief windows of vulnerability that skilled enemies can exploit. Beneath the void shields, physical armor provides the final layer of protection. Imperial warships mount armor plating measured in meters of thickness, composite materials incorporating adamantium, ceramite, and other substances that can withstand the hellish conditions of void combat. The design of this armor follows principles refined over 10,000 years of warfare.
Critical systems, such as plasma reactors, bridge sections, and munition storage, receive the heaviest protection, sometimes buried deep within the ship's interior, surrounded by less vital sections that can absorb damage. The prow of Imperial vessels carries particularly thick armor, allowing ships to charge directly toward enemy fire while presenting their smallest profile. This armored prow becomes a battering ram in boarding actions, smashing into enemy vessels to lock them in place while boarding parties storm through the breach. Even with meters of armor, though, capital ships remain vulnerable to sustained attack. Once shields fail, enemy fire begins chewing through armor plating, breaching hull sections, and venting atmosphere into space, starting fires that can spread through multiple decks, or striking critical systems that cripple the vessel's fighting capability. Boarding actions represent a unique aspect of void warfare. Engagements where the battle moves from exchange of fire at thousands of kilometers to vicious close-quarters combat within the cramped corridors of enemy vessels. The Imperial Navy maintains specialized boarding parties, armsmen trained in void combat and equipped with weapons and armor suited to fighting in the hazardous environment of damaged starships. These boarding parties can be delivered to enemy vessels through several methods. Shark assault boats, small craft designed to penetrate enemy hulls, carry squads of troops who cut their way through armor plating and storm through the breach. Boarding torpedoes function similarly, essentially armored projectiles containing armed soldiers that are fired directly at enemy ships.
Perhaps most dramatically, ships can simply ram each other, the collision locking both vessels together and creating numerous breach points through which boarding parties can advance. Once aboard an enemy vessel, boarders face a nightmarish environment where any wrong turn might lead into a compartment open to hard vacuum, where friendly fire in confined spaces proves as dangerous as enemy resistance, and where the very structure of the ship might collapse around them as the void battle continues outside. The objectives of boarding actions vary based on tactical situation. Sometimes the goal is simple destruction, setting charges throughout the enemy vessel that will detonate after the boarding party withdraws, scuttling the ship. Other times the objective is capture, seizing control of key systems like the bridge or engine rooms and compelling surrender. The most valuable prizes are enemy vessels that can be captured relatively intact, allowing the Navy to study enemy technology, interrogate captured crew, and potentially add the prize to Imperial service after extensive purification rituals. Space Marines excel at boarding actions, their superhuman physiology and advanced armor allowing them to survive conditions that would kill unaugmented humans. A single squad of Space Marines boarding an enemy vessel represents a threat out of all proportion to their numbers, capable of carving through enemy defenders and sabotaging critical systems with terrifying efficiency. Yet the Navy's own armsmen have conducted successful boarding actions for millennia, and veteran boarding parties develop a hard-earned expertise in shipboard combat that makes them respected even by the Adeptus Astartes. The void shields, armor, weapons, and propulsion systems of Imperial warships all depend on a single critical technology, the plasma reactor. These massive installations, sometimes dozens or even hundreds throughout a large capital ship, harness the fundamental forces that power stars, containing miniature suns in magnetic bottles that can release staggering amounts of energy. The plasma reactors provide power for everything from the artificial gravity that keeps crew members from floating helplessly through corridors to the lance batteries that can vaporize enemy escorts. When a ship enters battle, the power demands increase exponentially as weapons charge, shields reinforce, engines burn at maximum thrust, and damage control systems activate. The tech priests and reactor crews who maintain these systems perform their duties under conditions of extreme danger. Plasma containment is never perfect, and minor leaks bathe the reactor chambers in radiation intense enough to kill unprotected humans in seconds. The temperature inside reactor sections can soar to levels that require special heat-resistant equipment just to approach the machinery.
Despite all precautions, reactor accidents claim the lives of thousands of crew members across the fleet each year. Deaths recorded in engineering logs with mechanical precision, but mourned by those who understood the deceased had died maintaining the heart of their ship. The men who command the Imperial Navy's warships come predominantly, though not exclusively, from the noble houses of the Imperium. This is not mere aristocratic privilege, but a practical recognition that effective naval command requires extensive education and training that few outside the nobility can access. A Navy captain must understand not only tactical doctrine and fleet operations, but also navigation through the warp, the religious observances required to maintain crew morale, the political considerations that affect even routine patrol assignments, the technical capabilities and limitations of their vessel, and the leadership qualities necessary to command thousands of crew members who will spend their entire lives aboard ship. These skills are typically learned over decades of education, beginning in childhood and continuing through service as junior officers aboard operational vessels. Noble houses that have provided naval officers for generations maintain family traditions, passing down knowledge from parent to child, and often controlling access to command positions through networks of patronage and mutual obligation. Yet, the Navy also offers opportunities for advancement from the lower ranks, rare though such promotions might be. A warrant officer who demonstrates exceptional competence might be commissioned as a full officer, and from there could potentially rise through ability and fortune to command a vessel. Such officers, risen from the ranks, often face prejudice from their noble-born peers, but can also inspire intense loyalty from the crews they once served among. The Navy's traditions acknowledge this possibility of merit-based advancement, recognizing that ability can manifest regardless of birth, and that the service benefits from harnessing talent wherever it appears. Some of the Navy's most legendary commanders have emerged from humble origins, their names remembered centuries after noble-born contemporaries have been forgotten. Admiral Cornelius Lenz von Ravensburg stands among the most celebrated naval commanders in recent imperial history, the man who held the line against the forces of chaos during the Gothic War, also called the 12th Black Crusade of Abaddon the Despoiler. Born to one of the ancient noble houses of the Gothic sector, von Ravensburg entered naval service as a young man and distinguished himself through a combination of tactical brilliance, personal courage, and an intuitive understanding of void warfare that seemed almost prophetic. His rise through the ranks culminated in appointment as Lord Admiral of Battlefleet Gothic, command of one of the Imperium's most strategically vital naval forces. The Gothic sector, located in the Segmentum Obscurus relatively near the Eye of Terror, had always faced periodic chaos raids and minor incursions. But in 139.M41, something unprecedented occurred. Abaddon the Despoiler, most powerful of the Chaos Space Marine warlords and former first captain of the Sons of Horus Legion, launched a massive assault from the Eye of Terror, deploying a fleet that dwarfed previous raids. The 12th Black Crusade had begun, and Battlefleet Gothic stood directly in its path. The Gothic War would rage for years, a grinding campaign of fleet actions, planetary sieges, and desperate defensive stands that tested the Imperium's resolve. Von Ravensburg found himself commanding not only his own battle fleet, but coordinating with Space Marine chapters, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Imperial Guard, and various other Imperial organizations in a coalition defense against an enemy that possessed firepower and capabilities matching or exceeding what the Imperium could bring to bear.
The despoilers' forces included multiple Chaos Space Marine warbands, Traitor Guard regiments, Dark Mechanicum war engines, and most critically, ancient warships that dated back to the Horus Heresy itself. These vessels, corrupted by 10,000 years of exposure to the warp, mounted weapons and systems that the modern Imperium could barely comprehend, let alone counter. Among the most critical objectives of the 12th Black Crusade were the Blackstone fortresses, ancient alien constructs of unknown origin that drifted through the Gothic sector. 6 of these massive space stations existed, each kilometers in length and mounting weaponry capable of destroying planets. Their origin remained mysterious, relics of some long-vanished xenos civilization, but their power was undeniable. The Imperium controlled several of these fortresses, using them as strategic assets despite not fully understanding their operation. Abaddon's forces managed to capture or destroy multiple Blackstone fortresses during the war, turning the ancient weapons against Imperial targets and sowing destruction across entire systems.
The loss of these assets represented a strategic catastrophe, shifting the balance of power dramatically in favor of the Chaos forces. Von Ravensburg responded to these setbacks with a defensive strategy built around preserving his fleet while bleeding the enemy through a series of carefully chosen engagements. Rather than risk his capital ships in massive fleet actions where the enemy's superior numbers would prove decisive, von Ravensburg divided Battlefleet Gothic into smaller task forces that could strike at vulnerable enemy formations, interdict supply lines, and force the Chaos fleets to disperse their forces across multiple systems. This approach, while militarily sound, left numerous worlds temporarily exposed to enemy attack, and von Ravensburg bore the political consequences of these necessary sacrifices. Critics within the administratum and among planetary governors whose worlds suffered during the war accused him of cowardice, of failing to defend imperial citizens. These criticisms, though fundamentally unjust given the impossible situation von Ravensburg faced, would haunt him throughout and after the conflict. The Battle of Gethsemane represented perhaps the climactic naval engagement of the Gothic War. Abaddon's forces, having captured and corrupted 2 Blackstone fortresses, moved these ancient weapons into position to assault the crucial forge world of Kylus. Von Ravensburg understood that allowing Chaos forces to destroy Kylus would eliminate a critical industrial base and open the way to the sector capital at Port Ma. He therefore committed Battlefleet Gothic to a decisive engagement, gathering the majority of his surviving capital ships for a coordinated assault on the Chaos fleet. The battle that followed raged across multiple systems as the 2 fleets maneuvered for advantage. Von Ravensburg's forces succeeded in severely damaging 1 Blackstone fortress, forcing Abaddon to withdraw it from the engagement, but the cost proved severe. Multiple Imperial capital ships were lost, including several irreplaceable battleships, and the casualties among crews numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Despite these losses, the Battle of Gethsemane achieved its strategic objective. Abaddon's advance stalled, his forces unable to destroy Kylus or push deeper into the sector. Over the following months, as Imperial reinforcements finally began arriving from other sectors, the strategic balance shifted. Abaddon, recognizing that his window of opportunity had closed, ordered a general withdrawal, pulling his forces back toward the Eye of Terror and abandoning many of the systems his forces had conquered. The 12th Black Crusade had failed to achieve its ultimate objectives, though at staggering cost to the Imperium. Von Ravensburg had held the line, preserving the Gothic sector through years of desperate warfare.
But the victory felt hollow amid the ruins of devastated worlds and the graves of millions who had perished in the defense. In the aftermath, von Ravensburg faced an inquisitorial investigation into his conduct of the war.
Accusations ranged from incompetence to outright treachery, critics questioning his decisions to abandon certain systems, his reluctance to commit to fleet actions, his cooperation with xenos forces at various points during the conflict. The investigation ultimately cleared him of wrongdoing, recognizing that his decisions, while perhaps imperfect, had been made under impossible circumstances and had ultimately preserved the Gothic sector from conquest. Yet the experience left von Ravensburg embittered, and he reportedly withdrew from active service not long after, his health broken by years of stress and the weight of command decisions that had sent tens of thousands of naval personnel to their deaths. Lord Admiral Wrath represented a different archetype of Imperial naval commander, a man whose tactical conservatism and strict adherence to doctrine earned him both respect and criticism within the fleet. Commanding Battlefleet Scarus during the early phases of the 13th Black Crusade, Wrath faced the unenviable task of defending against another massive chaos offensive, while the Imperium's attention remained divided among multiple crisis zones. His approach emphasized concentration of force, refusing to disperse his fleet into small task forces that might be defeated in detail by numerically superior chaos forces. This strategy preserved his capital ships, but left numerous frontier systems vulnerable to raiding, and planetary governors whose worlds burned while Wrath's battle fleet remained concentrated at the sector capital were not shy about voicing their displeasure. The criticism of Wrath's strategy highlights a fundamental tension in Imperial naval doctrine. The Navy exists simultaneously to defend Imperial space against external threats, to project power in support of Imperial campaigns, to protect the shipping lanes that sustain the Imperium's economy, to maintain visible presence as a deterrent against rebellion, and to serve as strategic reserve against unforeseen emergencies. These missions often conflict directly with each other, forcing commanders to make decisions where any choice will leave some objective unfulfilled. A fleet concentrated for maximum combat power cannot simultaneously patrol dozens of systems. Escorts assigned to convoy duty cannot screen capital ships in fleet actions. Ships committed to supporting a guard offensive cannot respond to an enemy breakthrough in another sector. Every deployment decision represents a calculated risk, a choice to accept vulnerability in one area to achieve advantage in another. Lord Admiral Quarren, who commanded Battlefleet Cadia, faced perhaps the most difficult posting in the entire Imperial Navy. Cadia, the fortress world that stood watch over the Eye of Terror, represented the Imperium's first line of defense against chaos incursions. Battlefleet Cadia operated under permanent alert status, constantly reinforced and eternally undermanned given the sheer scale of threats emerging from the Eye. Quarren's tenure as Lord Admiral saw him oversee the defense of the Cadian Gate through countless smaller engagements, raids by Chaos warbands testing the defenses, pirate incursions seeking to exploit the constant warfare, and periodic major offensives that required mobilizing the entire battle fleet.
The strain of this posting, the constant warfare without respite, took its toll on officers and crew alike. Quarren himself reportedly slept no more than a few hours each day, maintaining personal oversight of fleet operations to a degree unusual even among the notoriously hands-on Imperial naval command culture. The fall of Cadia during the 13th Black Crusade represented the culmination of Abaddon's 10,000-year campaign against the Imperium. when Chaos forces finally shattered the Cadian Gate, destroying the world itself through use of the Blackstone fortress known as the Will of Eternity. Battlefleet Cadia fought to the last ship, attempting to evacuate Imperial forces and delay the enemy advance. Quarren himself died during the final evacuation, his flagship destroyed by Chaos cruisers as it covered the retreat of transport vessels carrying Cadian civilians and military personnel. His sacrifice, and that of thousands of naval personnel who gave their lives during Cadia's fall, bought time for millions to escape, preserving some remnant of Cadian military strength that would continue fighting in the dark days that followed. Solar Admiral Lysander Marcus serves as an example of the rising generation of Imperial naval commanders, officers who have come to prominence during the era following the opening of the Great Rift. Marcus distinguished himself during the defense of the Nockmund Gauntlet, one of the few stable routes through the Great Rift, commanding a cruiser squadron that successfully held off Chaos Raiders attempting to close this vital corridor. His tactical approach emphasized aggressive use of attack craft and torpedo salvos, leveraging these long-range strike assets to weaken enemy formations before closing to decisive range with his cruisers. This doctrine proved particularly effective against the Chaos and Xenos raiders that threatened the Gauntlet, enemies who often fielded individually powerful but poorly coordinated forces. Marcus has since been promoted to Solar Admiral and awaits assignment to his own sector command, though the chronic shortage of available commands means he may wait years before receiving such a posting. The careers of these commanders and countless others who have served the Imperial Navy across 10 millennia illustrate the diverse challenges that naval officers face. The admiral commanding a battle fleet in the relative peace of the Segmentum Solar deals with very different concerns than one defending against constant chaos raids near the Eye of Terror. The commander of a patrol squadron hunting pirates faces different tactical situations than one leading a fleet action against an enemy battle group. Yet all share certain fundamental responsibilities: maintaining the combat readiness of their vessels and crews, making tactical decisions that can determine the fates of millions, balancing political considerations against military necessity, and bearing the weight of command in an organization where mistakes can mean not just personal failure, but the loss of irreplaceable assets and the deaths of thousands. The doctrine and tactics of Imperial void warfare have been refined across 10,000 years of constant conflict against every imaginable enemy. This accumulated wisdom finds expression in the Tactica Imperialis, the massive compilation of military doctrine that governs how Imperial forces wage war. The sections dealing with naval operations stretch across hundreds of volumes, each detailing specific scenarios, enemy types, ship configurations, and recommended responses. Yet for all this codified knowledge, successful void combat requires adaptation and improvisation. No battle unfolds exactly as doctrine predicts, and commanders must balance the wisdom of accumulated experience against the unique circumstances of each engagement. The fundamental tactical paradigm of Imperial naval warfare centers on the broadside engagement. Imperial warships mount the majority of their weapons batteries along their flanks, creating devastating fields of fire perpendicular to their direction of travel. This configuration forces ships to maneuver to bring their broadsides to bear, while simultaneously trying to position themselves to rake enemy vessels along their length, where the thinner armor makes them more vulnerable. The ideal engagement, from an Imperial perspective, places friendly ships in a line of battle, where each vessel can fire its full broadside without risking friendly fire on nearby ships, while the enemy must advance directly into this wall of fire.
The classic crossing the T maneuver attempts to position the fleet perpendicular to an enemy formation, allowing every friendly ship to fire on the enemy, while the enemy vessels can only return fire with their forward-facing weapons. Range management forms another critical aspect of void warfare.
Most Imperial weapons operate most effectively at ranges classified as short or medium by void combat standards. Distances measured in thousands of kilometers, but still close enough that engagement times measure in minutes rather than hours. Ships with powerful lance armaments might engage at longer range, attempting to wear down enemy shields before closing, while vessels emphasizing weapons batteries prefer to close rapidly to unleash devastating point-blank fire. Torpedo-armed ships launch their salvos from maximum range, giving the torpedoes time to accelerate and close the distance while the launching vessel maneuvers for its next attack. This creates a complex dance of closing and opening ranges, ships jockeying for position to exploit their strengths while denying enemies the opportunity to use theirs. Fleet formations vary based on tactical situation and commander preference. The most basic formation, the line of battle, places ships in a single extended line with adequate spacing to prevent collisions and allow for maneuver. This formation maximizes broadside firepower, but can be vulnerable to being flanked or divided. The wall formation creates multiple parallel lines, providing depth and allowing damaged ships to fall back behind fresh vessels. The globe or sphere formation concentrates ships in a three-dimensional defensive posture, protecting vulnerable ships in the center while presenting a unified front to enemies approaching from any direction.
More complex formations include the claw, where the fleet splits into 2 or 3 groups attempting to envelop the enemy from multiple directions. The hammer and anvil, where one force pins the enemy while another strikes from an unexpected angle. And various screening formations, where escorts protect capital ships from torpedo and attack craft threats. The opening phase of a fleet engagement typically begins at ranges where only the longest ranged weapons can engage effectively, nova cannons and lance batteries exchanging fire while both fleets maneuver for advantage. Attack craft launch during this phase, racing ahead of their parent vessels to engage enemy fighters or begin their attack runs against enemy capital ships. Torpedo salvos might be launched, though at extreme range, the probability of successful hits decreases substantially. As the range closes, the volume of fire increases as more weapons come into effective range. Lance batteries begin finding their marks with increasing regularity, burning through enemy shields and scoring hits on armor. Medium-range weapons activate, adding their fire to the growing storm of energy and projectiles filling the space between the fleets. The decisive phase comes when the opposing fleets reach close range, where weapons batteries can unleash their full fury. The space between the fleets becomes an inferno of crisscrossing fire, shells and energy beams filling the void in such density that evasion becomes nearly impossible. Void shields flicker and collapse under sustained bombardment, exposing armor to direct fire that begins chewing through meters of protective plating.
Ships that lose shields quickly accumulate damage. Fires breaking out across multiple decks, hull breaches venting atmosphere, critical systems failing under the punishment. This is when battles are decided, when the accumulated damage finally cripples enough enemy vessels that one side or the other gains a decisive advantage. The fleet that maintains formation and fire discipline through this crucible typically emerges victorious, while the side that breaks formation or loses cohesion faces potential destruction as individual ships are surrounded and overwhelmed. The disengagement phase presents its own challenges.
A fleet that recognizes it faces defeat must extract itself from battle before losing so many vessels that escape becomes impossible. This requires discipline and coordination, ships covering each other as they accelerate away from the enemy, maintaining enough formation integrity to prevent the enemy from isolating and destroying fleeing vessels. The pursuing fleet attempts to prevent this escape, using faster vessels to harry the retreating enemy, launching torpedoes and attack craft to inflict additional damage, trying to cripple enemy engines to leave ships vulnerable to destruction. Many battles see the majority of casualties occur during this phase, when damaged ships struggling to escape fall behind their fellows and are overwhelmed by pursuing enemies. Beyond formal fleet actions, the Imperial Navy conducts numerous other types of void warfare. Convoy escort operations require different tactics, the emphasis shifting from defeating enemy fleets to protecting merchant vessels from raiders and pirates. Escort vessels screen the convoy, watching for enemy contacts and positioning themselves to intercept threats before they can reach the vulnerable transports. This often involves sacrificing the escorts themselves, engaging superior enemy forces to buy time for the convoy to scatter or escape. Patrol operations emphasize detection and interception. Ships moving through assigned zones, watching for unauthorized vessels or signs of enemy activity. When contact is made, patrol ships must balance immediate engagement against the need to call for reinforcement, a decision complicated by the fact that warp communication remains unreliable, and reinforcements might be days or weeks away, even if successfully summoned. Planetary assault operations see the Navy providing orbital bombardments and transport for ground forces. The bombardments can range from surgical strikes on specific military targets to wholesale devastation of entire continents. The precision of orbital fire depends on numerous factors: the capabilities of the ship's targeting systems, the skill of gunnery crews, weather conditions on the target world, and most critically, the rules of engagement. Destroying an enemy military installation while preserving nearby civilian centers requires careful targeting that limits the rate of fire and exposes the bombarding vessel to potential counterfire from surface defenses. In contrast, when a world has been declared exterminatus, warships can unleash their full arsenals without restraint, reducing entire worlds to lifeless rocks through sustained bombardment. The Navy must also contend with the unique challenges of combat in various void environments. Battle in the vicinity of asteroid fields or debris clouds provides cover that can be exploited tactically, but also creates navigation hazards that can damage or destroy ships. Combat near nebulae or stellar phenomena can interfere with sensors and targeting systems, forcing vessels to close to nearly point-blank range before they can reliably engage each other. Engagements near gravity wells, planets, or stars create additional complications, as ships must burn fuel to maintain stable orbits while simultaneously maneuvering in combat. Some particularly ruthless commanders have deliberately exploited gravity to their advantage, positioning their forces so that enemy ships driven from their position will fall into the planet or star, suffering destruction without a single shot fired. Life aboard an Imperial warship follows rhythms established over millennia of tradition, routines that provide structure and purpose to crews who may spend their entire lives without ever setting foot on a planetary surface. The day begins with morning prayers, crew members gathering in mess halls or chapels for services led by the ship's clergy. These services, though brief, serve multiple purposes beyond the obvious spiritual ones. They reinforce the sense of community among the crew, remind personnel of their duty to the Emperor and the Imperium, and provide a predictable routine that helps maintain morale during long voyages.
Following prayers, crew members proceed to their duty stations, beginning shifts that typically last between 8 and 12 hours, depending on the ship's operational status. The duties vary enormously based on one's role aboard ship.
Gunnery crews maintain the weapons batteries, performing endless equipment checks, running targeting drills, and loading shells into magazines that might hold thousands of rounds of ammunition. Engineering crews monitor the plasma reactors and propulsion systems, responding to alarms that might indicate anything from minor fluctuations to catastrophic failures. Navigation teams plot courses through real space and the warp, calculating translation coordinates with precision measured in fractions of degrees that can mean the difference between arriving at the intended destination and emerging light years off course. Damage control parties stand ready to respond to fires, hull breaches, or system failures, training constantly for emergencies that might come without warning. The armsmen who serve as the ship's internal security force patrol the corridors, break up fights among crew members, and maintain order in a floating city that might house 100,000 souls. The officers who command these crew members live in a different world, quite literally, given the separation between officer country and the enlisted quarters. Junior officers share small cabins with 1 or 2 roommates, cramped quarters that nonetheless provide privacy and personal space unavailable to enlisted personnel. Senior officers enjoy progressively larger accommodations as they rise through the ranks, culminating in the captain's quarters that might encompass multiple rooms, including sleeping chambers, private offices, dining areas for entertaining guests, and observation decks providing views of the void beyond. This apparent luxury serves a practical purpose, as noted before.
Officers who might spend 40 or 50 years aboard a single vessel need space to live, not merely exist, and the accommodations reflect their rank's authority and responsibility. The relationship between officers and enlisted crew follows strict hierarchical lines, but successful ships develop a culture where mutual respect coexists with formal discipline. The officers understand that their authority depends ultimately on the crew's willingness to follow orders, and that excessive harshness or arbitrary cruelty will erode that willingness. The crew members recognize that the officers bear responsibility for decisions that can mean life or death for everyone aboard, and that discipline exists not to demean them, but to maintain the order necessary for the ship to function. When this balance breaks down, when officers become tyrannical or crew members mutinous, the ship's effectiveness suffers until the situation is resolved through either reform or replacement of the responsible parties. Ships develop their own cultures and traditions that can persist across generations of crew members. A vessel might have particular saints it honors, rituals performed before entering combat, lucky talismans that crew members touch for fortune, or traditional duties assigned to the newest crew members. These traditions create continuity, linking current crew members to the thousands or millions who have served aboard the vessel across its service life. Old hands share stories of past battles and legendary officers with newer crew members, passing down an oral history that supplements the ship's official logs. The ship itself becomes almost a living thing in the crew's perception. The machine spirit, not merely a technical concept, but a presence they feel watching over them. Angry when maintenance is neglected, but beneficent when properly honored. Recreation aboard ship takes forms adapted to the limited space and resources available. Lower deck crew members might gather in mess halls to gamble, tell stories, or watch grainy recordings of entertainment broadcasts from distant worlds. Athletic competitions, wrestling, or boxing matches between crew members provide both entertainment and a relatively safe outlet for aggression. Some ships maintain libraries or data archives where literate crew members can read approved texts.
The most precious form of entertainment, though, is simply sleep, a chance to escape the grinding routine of shipboard life for a few hours. Officers enjoy more varied recreation, with some ships maintaining gaming rooms, observation lounges, or even small parks with hydroponically grown plants. The captain's table provides an opportunity for senior officers to dine together, combining a meal with shop talk about the ship's operations and current situation. The transition into and out of warp space marks the most dramatic events in routine shipboard life. Entering the warp requires extensive preparation. Tech priests performing rituals to appease machine spirits, navigator preparing to guide the ship through the immaterium, and crew members securing everything loose as the ship's Geller field activates.
This field, a protective bubble that maintains a barrier between real space and the warp, is literally all that prevents the ship and everyone aboard from being consumed by warp entities. When the ship translates into the warp, crew members experience sensations that vary from mild discomfort to overwhelming nausea. Reality becomes unstable, time flows irregularly, and the sensitive can feel the presence of things beyond the ship's hull, entities drawn to the Geller field's light like moths to flame. Life during warp transit follows different rhythms than real space operations. Combat is rarely possible, though warp predators occasionally attack ships, forcing crews to battle creatures that defy physical law. The greater danger comes from within, the warp's influence slowly eroding sanity and discipline if the voyage extends too long. Small incidents, arguments that turn violent, equipment that malfunctions in ways that seem almost deliberate, visions and nightmares that drive crew members to irrational behavior. These multiply the longer a ship remains in the warp. The ship's clergy work overtime during these periods, conducting services, blessing equipment, and counseling crew members struggling with warp-induced terrors. When translation back to real space finally occurs, the relief is palpable. Crew members celebrating their survival of another warp voyage with impromptu parties or quiet prayers of thanksgiving. The Imperial Navy faces numerous ongoing challenges beyond the immediate threats of enemy fleets. The single greatest problem is the chronic shortage of vessels relative to the territory that must be defended. The Imperium spans 1,000,000 worlds across 100,000 light years, but the Navy fields perhaps 100,000 capital ships when one counts all battleships, cruisers, and large escorts. This disparity means that no more than 1 world in 10 can maintain a permanent naval presence, and even that requires dispersing the fleet to such a degree that individual ships or small squadrons face threats alone, without possibility of timely reinforcement. The Navy attempts to compensate through deterrence and response capability. The knowledge that an attack on an imperial world will eventually bring retaliation encourages potential enemies to seek easier targets, while the ability to assemble battle groups from scattered vessels means that major threats can be confronted with adequate force, even if that force requires weeks or months to gather. The loss rate of naval vessels compounds the shortage problem. Unlike ground forces, where casualties can often be replaced relatively quickly through recruitment and training of new personnel, losing a capital ship means losing decades or centuries of investments in construction, equipment, and crew training. A cruiser destroyed in battle might require 50 years to replace, assuming the shipyards have capacity available and resources can be allocated to construction. A lost battleship might never be replaced, the Imperium's manufacturing capability unable to match attrition among its most powerful vessels. This creates a strategic calculus where preserving the fleet becomes as important as achieving victory.
and commanders who lose ships, even in tactically successful engagements, may face censure or even execution for wasting irreplaceable resources. Crew shortages also plague the Navy, though the mechanisms differ from vessel shortages. The Imperium contains billions of potential crew members, but finding individuals with the specific skills required for particular positions remains challenging. Tech priests capable of maintaining plasma reactors spend decades in training before they achieve sufficient competence. Navigators, the specialized psychers who guide ships through the warp, come exclusively from a small number of navigator houses and cannot be replaced if lost. Voidborn crew members, those raised aboard ships or orbital stations, adapt to shipboard life more readily than those recruited from planetary populations, but the Voidborn population remains limited. The Navy addresses these shortages through press ganging, forcibly recruiting individuals from planets the fleet visits. But pressed crew members often lack essential skills and require extensive training before they become productive members of the crew. The technological stagnation affecting the wider Imperium impacts the Navy as severely as any other institution. The great shipyards can maintain existing vessels and produce new ships following established patterns, but genuine innovation remains exceedingly rare. This means that the Navy fights with weapons and ships that differ little from those used 1,000 or 5,000 years earlier, while enemies potentially field vessels incorporating innovations or exotic technologies that Imperial forces struggle to counter. Some Imperial officers chafe at the restrictions imposed by the Adeptus Mechanicus, the prohibition on deviation from established patterns, the dismissal of experimental weapons or new tactical doctrines as tech heresy. Yet, the conservative approach has merit. The Mechanicus understands from bitter experience that seemingly minor modifications can have catastrophic unintended consequences, and that the ancient patterns, while perhaps not optimal, have proven their reliability across millennia of service. The growing threat of chaos, particularly following the opening of the Great Rift, presents the Navy with challenges unlike any it has faced before. Where xenos threats remain comprehensible, aliens motivated by recognizably rational objectives, even when those objectives conflict with Imperial interests, chaos represents fundamental irrationality. Enemies whose goals seem designed solely to spread suffering and corruption. Chaos warships operate according to principles that defy normal void warfare doctrine. Ships that should be crippled continue fighting, powered by warp energies rather than conventional plasma reactors. Vessels that appear on sensors in one location suddenly manifest elsewhere, having traversed distances that should require hours or days of travel in mere moments. Most insidiously, chaos corruption spreads through contact. Crew members exposed to chaos vessels or their weapons sometimes turning traitor, their loyalties subverted by whispers from the warp. The opening of the Great Rift, the massive wound in reality that now splits the Imperium nearly in half, has transformed strategic calculations for battle fleets throughout Imperial space. The rift itself represents a navigation hazard unprecedented in scale, a barrier of churning warp energy that prevents standard warp travel through vast regions of the galaxy. The scattered corridors that allow passage through the rift, such as Minachmun Gauntlet, have become strategic choke points of immense importance, heavily fortified and desperately contested by all sides. Battle fleets that once enjoyed relatively secure rear areas now find themselves exposed to chaos incursions emerging from the rift with little warning. The balance of naval power has shifted dramatically,
with some sectors suddenly finding themselves on the front lines of an existential struggle, while others that previously bore the brunt of chaos raids now enjoy relative security behind the wall of warp storms. The return of Robota Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, has injected new energy into the Imperial Navy's operations, though not without controversy. Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade, a massive military offensive launched to stabilize the Imperium following the opening of the Great Rift, relies heavily on the Primarch's ability to coordinate naval assets across multiple sectors simultaneously. His personal authority, backed by the Primarch's legendary status, allows him to override normal chains of command, requisitioning vessels from sector battlefleets and assembling them into crusade fleets that operate under his direct control. This concentration of force has achieved remarkable successes, liberating systems that had fallen to chaos or xenos invaders and stabilizing regions that seemed on the verge of collapse. The return of Robota Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, has injected new energy into the Imperial Navy's operations, though not without controversy. Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade, a massive military offensive launched to stabilize the Imperium following the opening of the Great Rift, relies heavily on the Primarch's ability to coordinate naval assets across multiple sectors simultaneously. His personal authority, backed by the Primarch's legendary status, allows him to override normal chains of command, requisitioning vessels from sector battlefleets and assembling them into crusade fleets that operate under his direct control. This concentration of force has achieved remarkable successes, liberating systems that had fallen to chaos or xenos invaders and stabilizing regions that seemed on the verge of collapse.
Yet it has also stripped defensive fleets of their capital ships, leaving sectors vulnerable to raids and incursions, while their most powerful vessels campaign elsewhere under Guilliman's banner. The Navy's relationship with other Imperial organizations remains complex, defined by both cooperation and rivalry. The Adeptus Mechanicus, as the Imperium's manufacturing base and the source of technical expertise, maintains enormous influence over naval operations. Tech priests serve aboard every vessel, maintaining the sacred machine spirits and performing the rituals necessary to keep systems operational. The great Forge Worlds construct the Navy's ships, provide its weapons and ammunition, and control access to the specialized knowledge required for repairs and maintenance. This dependence creates tension when Navy requirements conflict with Mechanicus priorities, as when Forge Worlds divert resources to projects the Navy considers frivolous, while critical ship repairs languished for want of parts and technical support. The Mechanicus, for its part, views the Navy as frequently careless with the sacred machines under their care, pushing vessels beyond safe operational parameters and failing to observe proper maintenance rituals. Relations with the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marine chapters, remain cordial but distant. The Space Marines maintain their own fleets, battle barges, and strike cruisers operated by chapter serfs under the command of Space Marine officers. These vessels, while formidable, remain outside the Navy's chain of command, and Space Marine chapters frequently pursue their own objectives with little coordination with nearby Navy forces. When cooperation does occur, typically during major campaigns where both Navy and Space Marine forces operate in the same region, the results can be spectacular, combining the Navy's firepower and numbers with Space Marine boarding actions and ground assault capabilities. Yet the fundamental difference in organizational culture, the Navy's emphasis on hierarchy and procedure, versus the Space Marines' more flexible and initiative-driven approach, creates friction that commanders on both sides must carefully manage.
The Inquisition maintains its own vessels and can requisition Navy assets when pursuing investigations, a power that Navy officers sometimes resent but cannot refuse. An inquisitor arriving aboard a Navy vessel carries absolute authority, able to commandeer the ship, order course changes, demand access to all records and personnel, and generally disrupt normal operations in pursuit of their investigation. Most inquisitors exercise this authority judiciously, understanding that naval cooperation proves more valuable than resentful compliance. But incidents of inquisitorial overreach remain common enough to fuel interorganizational tensions. The League of Black Ships, Inquisition vessels that transport psychers to Terra, enjoy special status within the Navy. Their sacred cargo, meaning they receive priority escort and support regardless of other operational requirements. The rogue traders, merchant princes granted warrants allowing them to travel beyond the Imperium's borders in search of profit and new worlds to bring into compliance, occupy a unique position relative to the Navy.
Their warrants, often granted by the Emperor himself or by organizations operating in his name, place rogue traders technically outside naval jurisdiction, while simultaneously granting them authority that can rival or exceed that of Navy officers in frontier regions. The most successful rogue traders command fleets that rival sector battle fleets in size, though typically composed of converted merchant vessels rather than purpose-built warships. Relations between the Navy and rogue traders vary enormously based on personalities and circumstances. Some Navy officers view rogue traders as rivals who siphon off resources and manpower that should serve the Imperium directly, while others recognize rogue traders as valuable allies who provide intelligence from beyond Imperial borders and occasionally reinforce naval operations with their private fleets. Piracy remains an endemic problem throughout Imperial space. Small-scale raids and attacks on shipping that cumulatively inflict economic damage far exceeding their apparent military significance. Pirate forces range from individual vessels crewed by desperate refugees or criminals to organized fleets commanded by renegade Navy officers or fallen noble houses. The most successful pirate organizations establish bases in wilderness zones or unclaimed systems, using their knowledge of local space to evade Navy patrols and escape when larger forces arrive. Suppressing piracy requires sustained commitment of escort vessels to patrol duties, a mission that lacks the glory of fleet actions but proves essential to maintaining the flow of trade that sustains the Imperium's economy.
Some pirates operate under letters of marque, essentially privateer licenses granted by planetary governors or other authorities, granting them legal protection to prey on enemies of the Imperium, while theoretically leaving friendly shipping unmolested. The line between legitimate privateer and illegal pirates often blurs in practice, with vessels that claim to be hunting xenos or chaos raiders coincidentally also attacking merchant ships carrying valuable cargo. The various xenos races that infest the galaxy each present unique challenges to the Imperial Navy. The orcs, brutal and warlike aliens who live for combat, field ramshackle fleets of salvaged vessels held together by equal parts mechanical ingenuity and psychic belief. Orc ships individually pose little threat to properly maintained Imperial vessels, their weapons crude and their armor inadequate, but orcs attack in vast numbers that can overwhelm even prepared defenses through sheer mass. The greenskins seem to appear from nowhere, orc populations spontaneously arising on worlds that had been clear of their taint, and their fleets grow exponentially when not regularly culled through aggressive Navy operations. An orc Wa,
A massive migration when countless orcs unite under a particularly powerful warlord can field thousands of vessels, and stopping such a force requires concentrating multiple battle fleets, stripping other regions of protection to assemble the necessary firepower. The Eldar, ancient aliens who once ruled the galaxy before the birth of the Chaos god Slaanesh shattered their empire, operate fleets whose technology far exceeds anything the Imperium can field.
Eldar vessels move with impossible speed and grace, their weapons striking from ranges where Imperial ships cannot effectively return fire, and their ability to use the webway for instantaneous travel across vast distances makes them nearly impossible to trap or pursue. Fortunately for the Imperium, the Eldar remain few in number, their fleets typically consisting of a handful of vessels rather than the massive armadas they once commanded. Engagements with Eldar forces often prove frustrating for Imperial commanders, the aliens striking at Imperial shipping or raiding installations, then disappearing before substantial forces can respond. Some Imperial officers have established unofficial truces with nearby Eldarcraft worlds, recognizing that the aliens pose less threat than Chaos or Orcs, and that forcing the Eldar into desperate circumstances might provoke responses that would cost the Imperium far more than the current Cold Peace. The Tau, relative newcomers to the galactic stage, field technologically advanced fleets organized around long-range firepower and coordinated tactics. Tau vessels favor standoff engagements, using their superior sensor capabilities and weapon ranges to devastate Imperial formations before those forces can close to effective range. The Tau's doctrine of massed firepower and mutual support creates interlocking fields of fire that punish Imperial charges, and their willingness to retreat rather than accept unfavorable engagement makes them difficult to bring to decisive battle. The Tau Empire remains relatively small, confined to the galactic east, but their rapid expansion and sophisticated technology mark them as a growing threat that the Navy monitors carefully. Some Imperial authorities have proposed massive offensives to crush the Tau before they become too powerful. But the Imperium's numerous other threats make committing sufficient forces difficult. The Tyranids represent perhaps the most alien and terrifying threat the Navy faces. These biomechanical horrors travel the void in living ships, organisms the size of cruisers or battleships that spit bioweapons and launch swarms of smaller creatures to overwhelm enemy defenses. Tyranid fleets advance behind a psychic shadow that disrupts warp travel and astropathic communication, effectively isolating target systems before the attack even begins. Naval engagements against Tyranids prove especially horrific, the aliens showing no fear or hesitation, accepting catastrophic casualties to close with Imperial vessels and deploy boarding organisms that tear through hulls and consume everything organic within. Worlds that fall to Tyranid invasions are stripped bare, every scrap of biomass consumed to fuel the High Fleet's growth, leaving only barren rock behind. The Navy's response to Tyranid threats emphasizes preventing the aliens from making planetfall, using sustained bombardment to destroy hive ships before they can deploy their ground forces, even at the cost of accepting ship-to-ship casualties that would be unacceptable in conventional engagements. The Necrons, ancient mechanical beings who once ruled the galaxy before entering a millions-year slumber, have begun awakening across Imperial space, and their vessels possess capabilities that seem to defy natural law. Necron ships self-repair damage that would cripple Imperial vessels. Their weapons phase through void shields and armor as if those protections did not exist, and their ability to utilize ancient stasis technology allows them to hibernate for millennia before suddenly reactivating without warning. Most terrifyingly, the Necrons possess weapons capable of destroying stars, exterminating entire systems with a precision and finality that makes even Exterminatus seem merciful by comparison. Fortunately, the Necrons remain fragmented, individual tomb worlds awakening independently rather than coordinating as a unified force. But the potential threat they represent haunts Navy strategic planning, the nightmare scenario where these ancient beings awaken fully and turn their incomprehensible technology against the Imperium. Beyond these major threats, countless minor xenos species infest the void, from species barely advanced enough to achieve spaceflight to mysterious aliens whose capabilities remain unknown. The Navy maintains extensive xenological databases, compiled from 10,000 years of encounters, and cataloging the characteristics, capabilities, and preferred tactics of hundreds of known alien species. Yet new xenos continue to be discovered regularly, emerging from previously unexplored regions or migrating into Imperial space from beyond the galaxy's borders. Each first contact carries the potential for disaster, an unknown enemy whose weapons and tactics might catch Imperial forces unprepared. And the Navy's standing orders emphasize caution when encountering unfamiliar xenos, gathering intelligence and calling for reinforcement rather than engaging without adequate preparation. The logistics of maintaining the Imperial Navy present challenges as daunting as the combat operations themselves.
Every vessel requires constant maintenance, systems breaking down or wearing out that must be repaired or replaced before they fail catastrophically. Ammunition must be regularly replenished. The massive shells fired by macro cannons weighing tons each and consumed by thousands during even modest engagements. Fuel for the plasma reactors, food for the crews, replacement parts for damaged systems. These supplies must flow constantly to keep the fleet operational. The Navy maintains supply depots throughout Imperial space, massive orbital stations that serve as warehouses for the material required to sustain operations. These depots themselves require protection, becoming high-value targets that enemies seek to destroy or capture. And the convoy routes connecting depots to operational fleets form vital arteries that must be defended against raiders and pirates. The shipyards where new vessels are constructed and battle-damaged ships are repaired represent strategic assets of incalculable value. The greatest shipyards, orbiting Mars, Cypra Mundi, Hydrafer, and other major forge worlds, can service entire battle fleets simultaneously. They're massive slipyards capable of accommodating even the largest battleships. These installations employ millions of workers, from tech priests overseeing the most delicate systems, to servitors performing rote labor, to skilled artisans crafting components that cannot be mass-produced. The destruction of a major shipyard can cripple a sector's defensive capability for decades or longer, the time required to rebuild the infrastructure exceeding the time needed to construct new vessels.
During major campaigns, control of shipyard facilities often becomes a primary strategic objective, both sides recognizing that the ability to repair battle damage and return vessels to service can prove as decisive as the outcome of individual engagements. The training of new crew members, particularly specialists such as pilots, gunnery officers, and navigators, requires years or decades of intensive education. The Navy maintains training facilities on dozens of worlds, academies where promising candidates receive instruction in the arts of void warfare, navigation, ship handling, and the 1,000 other skills required for effective naval service. The curriculum combines practical experience aboard training vessels with classroom instruction covering doctrine, history, and technical subjects. Officer candidates typically enter the academies in their youth, spending a decade or more in training before receiving their first assignments aboard operational vessels. The standards remain rigorous, with substantial portions of each class washing out, judged insufficient for the demands of naval service. Those who graduate carry the pride of their achievement throughout their careers, and the bonds formed between classmates often prove as important as formal chains of command in coordinating fleet operations. The naval hierarchy extends beyond the officers who command ships to encompass numerous support and administrative positions. Fleet supply officers manage the complex logistics of keeping vessels operational, coordinating with the Departmental Monitorum to ensure that necessary supplies reach the right ships at the right times. Intelligence officers analyze reports from scouts and spies, attempting to predict enemy movements and identify vulnerabilities that tactical forces can exploit. Communications officers maintain the astropathic networks that allow ships separated by light years to coordinate their actions, a task complicated by the inherent unreliability of warp-based communication. Medical officers oversee the health of crews, treating injuries and illnesses while also monitoring for signs of chaos corruption or other spiritual ailments that might affect a crew's effectiveness. The role of the Imperial Navy extends into civil functions beyond pure military operations. Navy vessels often transport Imperial officials traveling between star systems, provide emergency assistance to planets struck by natural disasters or famine, and maintain the visible presence of Imperial authority in regions where other Imperial organizations lack significant presence. Some Navy officers take pride in these civil missions, viewing them as opportunities to genuinely help Imperial citizens and demonstrate that the Navy exists to protect them, not merely to wage war. Others resent what they see as a misuse of military assets, warships designed for combat being diverted to ferry passengers or deliver humanitarian supplies, while real threats go unaddressed elsewhere. The tension between these perspectives reflects broader debates within Imperial society about the purpose of military forces and their relationship to civilian populations. The future of the Imperial Navy remains as uncertain as the Imperium itself. The long-term trends appear troubling. Attrition of irreplaceable vessels outpacing new construction. Technological stagnation preventing development of weapons or tactics that might counter emerging threats, and the growing power of chaos following the Great Rift's opening, threatening to overwhelm defenses that have held for 10,000 years. Yet, the Navy has faced periods of crisis before and survived through the courage of its personnel, the skill of its commanders, and occasional unexpected advantages that shifted the strategic balance. The return of Roboute Guilliman offers hope that the Imperium might stabilize and begin reversing its long decline, though whether the Primarch's reforms will prove sufficient remains to be seen. The ordinary sailors and officers who crew the fleet rarely think in such grand strategic terms. Their concerns remain immediate and personal. Surviving their current patrol, maintaining their ship systems, completing their assigned missions, and perhaps returning home to families they have not seen in years or decades. These individuals, from the lowliest pressed crew member to the most exalted Lord Admiral, form the beating heart of the Imperial Navy. Their dedication, their willingness to sacrifice everything in service to the Emperor and the Imperium, sustains the fleet through impossible odds and endless warfare. When a naval vessel engages an enemy force, knowing that defeat means not merely their own deaths, but potentially the doom of the world they are defending. When crew members man their stations through horrific damage and casualties.
when commanders make decisions that send thousands to their deaths in hopes of saving millions. These moments of courage and determination vindicate the Navy's existence and justify the tremendous resources the Imperium devotes to maintaining its void armadas. The ships themselves, those kilometers-long cathedrals of war that patrol the void, stand as monuments to human determination and ingenuity. Each vessel represents countless lives, the workers who built it, the crew who maintain it, those who have died defending it, and those who will someday crew it in battles yet unfought. The oldest ships in the fleet carry histories spanning thousands of years, their hulls walking with the ghosts of former crew members whose names have been forgotten, but whose service helped write the ship's saga. New ships, fresh from the shipyards with their armor still pristine and their systems untested in battle, await the baptism of fire that will transform them from mere machines into true warships with souls earned through blood and sacrifice. The traditions of the Navy, passed down across 10,000 years, bind the service together across the vast distances of space and time. The ceremonies that mark a ship's commissioning, the protocols for surrendering a defeated vessel, the honors rendered to fallen comrades, the 100 other rituals, great and small, that define naval culture. These create continuity with the past and connection between sailors who will never meet, but who share the common bond of service. When a young officer stands their first watch on the bridge of a capital ship, they stand in the footsteps of 10,000 officers who have stood similar watches on that same bridge, facing threats that perhaps differed in detail but not in fundamental character, making decisions that required the same courage and judgment demanded of their ancient predecessors. The motto of the Imperial Navy, inscribed in high Gothic above the entrance to the Naval Academy on Baca and repeated aboard countless vessels throughout the fleet, captures the service's essential character. In voidum imperator protegimus, which translates as, "In the void we protect the Emperor," or more loosely, "Through the void, the Emperor's protection." This simple phrase encompasses the Navy's purpose and its pride. The void, that cold darkness between the stars where humanity stands alone against hostile forces that would see the species destroyed or enslaved, remains the Navy's domain. The battlefield where it has fought for 10 millennia and will fight for 10,000 more if necessary. The protection offered is not merely to the Emperor's physical person, though Battlefleet Solar stands ever ready to defend Terra itself, but to his Imperium, the million worlds that carry forward his vision of united humanity. And the phrase acknowledges that this protection flows both ways. The Emperor's divine will sustaining the Navy even as the Navy defends his realm. Standing on the bridge of a Navy capital ship as it prepares for battle, one feels the weight of this history and tradition. The crew members move with practiced efficiency to their stations, each person a small part of a vast organism that is the ship itself. The captain, seated in the command throne, reviews tactical displays showing the disposition of friendly and enemy forces, making calculations that will determine whether their vessel survives the coming engagement. In the chapel, the ship's clergy lead prayers for those who are about to face death, offering what comfort faith can provide. In the lower decks, crew members check weapons and seal bulkheads, preparing for the possibility of boarding actions or hull breaches. The tech priests tend to machine spirits, burning incense and chanting benedictions over critical systems. And throughout the ship, 10,000 or 100,000 souls wait, each with their own fears and hopes, united by common cause and common danger. When the order comes to engage,
when the ship's weapons batteries open fire and the void between the fleets fills with destruction, when the hull shakes under enemy fire and the casualty reports begin flooding in, this is when the Navy's true character reveals itself. Not in the grand strategic planning or the diplomatic maneuvering, but in these moments of mortal peril, when ordinary humans face weapons and enemies that could annihilate them in an instant, yet they stand their ground and fight, because to do otherwise would betray everything they believe in. The gunner who continues loading shells even as his station fills with toxic smoke from burning insulation. The officer who calmly issues orders while fire spreads through the bridge. The tech priest who holds a failing reactor together through sheer force of will and prayer. The armsmen who charge into a boarding action knowing they face enemies who will show no mercy. These are the moments that define the Imperial Navy. In the aftermath of battle, whether in victory or defeat, the survivors gather to honor the fallen and assess the damage. The dead receive what funeral rites circumstances allow, their bodies consigned to the void with appropriate ceremony, or, if circumstances permit, preserved for burial upon reaching the next port. The wounded receive medical care, limited though resources might be, and attempt to recover sufficiently to return to duty. The ship itself undergoes damage assessment and repair. Tech priests working miracles with whatever materials remain available to restore critical systems to functionality. And through it all, the Navy endures, mourning its losses, celebrating its victories, learning from its mistakes, and preparing for the next battle. Because that next battle will come, as certainly as the stars shine in the void, and the Navy must be ready. The Imperial Navy stands as one of humanity's greatest achievements, an organization that has endured for 10,000 years through continuous warfare, that has adapted to threats beyond counting, that has produced heroes whose names echo through history, and countless unnamed souls who sacrifice protected worlds they would never see. It is an imperfect institution, plagued by corruption, hidebound by tradition, restricted by technological limitations, and hobbled by the same bureaucratic inefficiency that affects every aspect of the Imperium. Yet, for all its flaws, the Navy remains effective, remains necessary, remains the shield that stands between humanity and the darkness that would consume it. The warships that patrol the void are not merely machines of war, but symbols of humanity's refusal to surrender, testaments to the determination that has allowed the species to survive and even prosper in a galaxy that seems designed to destroy it. As long as one human vessel remains in the void, carrying the Emperor's banner and crewed by souls willing to die in his service, as long as the shipyards of Mars and 100 other Forge worlds continue launching new vessels to replace those lost in battle, as long as young men and women continue answering the call to naval service despite knowing the dangers they will face, the Imperial Navy will endure. It will continue its eternal vigil, watching the stars for threats, defending the Imperium's borders, carrying the Emperor's light into the darkness. And 10,000 years from now, if humanity survives that long, there will still be Imperial warships patrolling the void, still be officers standing watch on darkened bridges, still be crew members tending to ancient systems and preparing for battles they hope will never come, but know inevitably will. This is the legacy of the Navis Imperialis, the eternal promise of the void armadas of the Emperor, a promise written not in words, but in the lives of countless billions who have served, who serve now, and who will serve in ages yet to come.